make a small contribution to this bill. I think it's a very important bill, and that I think that, first of all, I'd just like to thank the people who've actually made this possible, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank the former Assistant Minister for Autism, the Honourable Emily Burke in the other House, who's now the Minister for Advocacy. Also like to thank the Minister for Transport in this place, and his staff and the people in the department, because while this may be not one of the biggest reforms we bring in, it will change the lives of a lot of ordinary people in a big way, and that's the important thing. And the member for Chafee has outlined a case which was brought to his attention, and I'm sure there are cases like that right across the state. I certainly have had parents in the past talk to me about the difficulty they've had with children who are neurodivergent, and trying to actually get them in and out of a car to a place where it's going to the doctors, shopping or schools. And the school one is an example I'd like just to highlight how big an issue this is. So for parents who have children who are neurodivergent, getting them across the road or getting them from point A to point B, when there's a lot of activity around, particularly around school time, attending school or leaving school, it is quite a challenge. It is a challenge. And if you have 2 or 3 children who are neurodivergent, the challenge becomes impossible. And because under the current scheme, or perhaps I might refer to as the previous scheme, they were ineligible for a disability parking permit. Often they had to park either far away from an entrance to a school, or they had to park sometimes, and they would sometimes park in loading zones or some zone which was closer for their own child's safety. Now, I remember receiving a case, in my case, where this person, in fact, was a grandparent. The grandparent was a carer and looking after their grandchildren, and they were in a special class in one of my schools. They parked in a loading zone because it was just for their child's safety, They got booked by the council officers, and the council would not remit the penalty. They had to pay the penalty. So the current scheme, unfortunately, allows council's officers to perhaps not exercise, or who choose not to exercise their discretion in what I think is an appropriate way. This person could clearly demonstrate their grandchildren had a disability, etc. But no, these people who actually applied the rules, for applying the rules for the rules' sake. My view is you apply rules for the purpose they're intended. What's the objective behind the rule? And that you need to understand that. And when you get told, oh, we applied the penalty because it's against the rules. Well, no. What are the rules trying to achieve? And unfortunately, the current rules do enable council officers to do that. In my view, wrongly. So this, and that's really highlighted to me. And that's not the only case. I've had a number of these cases in my electorate, and I'm sure there are a lot of other families who've not come to me or their local MP and just wore it, unfortunately. It is sad that perhaps people on the ground who actually have to implement the rules cannot show, if you like, more judgment at times. But that's another story for another day. These changes are important in another way too, apart from the practical changes in people's lives day to day. And as I said, not a big reform, but it's a big change for those people who benefit from this. And because it's not a one-off thing, it's people who experience this issue every day. Every day they take their child to school, every day they take a child or family member to a shop. Every day it's an issue for them. And you can understand why, I would actually say, why are these rules like that? It is also important because it also changes our thinking about people living with disability. From a disability has to be seen, has to be visible, to acknowledging there are people who live in disability who have invisible disabilities. And one of those things which we are also supporting is the project, the Sunflower Project, which tries to actually get the message out that not all disabilities, people with disabilities, can be seen. And particularly people, people with neurodivergent people, a whole range of other people who are, the disability is not obvious or is invisible. It doesn't mean that they don't experience some disadvantage and some challenges with their everyday lives. And so this bill helps to remove some of those disadvantage and those barriers and, for those lives. And I know the Metropolitan Fire Service have a program called the Sunflower Project, which is supported also by the Office for Autism in our state, and then something which was championed also by the former Assistant Minister for Autism, who's now the Minister for Autism. She championed to make sure that the message gets out, that we shouldn't make judgment so quickly about people accessing disability rights for people with disabilities. So that's very important. In the end, and I know, and I'm going to use a word which has now become a little slightly dirty word and a derided word, this is about inclusion. Now, you know, unfortunately, in the political world, this word now has become slightly a word which you're not supposed to use, or it's used in a way, in a negative sense. But for me, inclusion means giving people a fair go. And in Australian culture, if there's one thing we do believe in, and we strongly believe in, is a fair go for everybody. In other words, it means we give people a fair go to an education, a fair go to work, a fair go to access health system. We do believe in the fair go. The reason we have one of the best health systems in the world, because we believe that everybody has a right or should have a fair go to health, irrespective of their wealth. You know, health should not be linked to a person's wealth. Health should be linked to a person's need. And what this bill does, gives a whole range of people and their families a fair go. So when they're taking their child to school, they have a fair go about getting that child to school in a safe way, and also making sure that you know, it is easy as possible to do so. It's a fair go when they go to the shopping centre. When there's, again, a lot of activity, it gives those families a fair go to take their children with them. And as one of the previous speakers spoke about it, you know, the assumption is if they're children, they can be managed, easily managed. Well, I've seen some children, and I'm not a tall person, I accept that, but some of these children are big children, and they're not easily physically managed. And so having the proximity of a disability park in which it provides for disability is really important. It is important for that family. And often for people who don't have a child or family member with a disability, it is hard to grasp at that. But when you have to put up with this every day, it is a real challenge. So it's really important that this new provision makes it. It's been a long time coming, but it's here, and we, like the member for Playford said, we should applaud this reform, but let's not forget there are probably other reforms we need to think about, because there are others we need to do as well. Now, this reform is great. It will increase demand for parking for people living with a disability. That's just a reality, because you'll make more people eligible, quite rightly, and it will increase demand. So we need to monitor how this scheme, the impact it is, and whether we need to review those matters in terms of the number of parkings which is made available for disability. Importantly though, it also means as a community, we need to be responsible and not misuse those, in the sense that if you don't have a parking permit to park in an area, don't use it, irrespective of the amount of time. And all the excuses in the world don't count. So I think it's important to do that. And I've received some feedback from some people who do have a parking permit to park in an area reserved for people with disabilities, is that some people would like to see our penalties harsher. Now, we need to see how things go, how they settle down, and whether that's appropriate. We need to see what's happening interstate and what is best practice. I have a person in my community who's been advocating for some years that if you park in an area in a car park reserved for a person who is living with a disability, and you don't have a permit, you get caught, the expiation should be demerit points, like any other licence infringement. Now, I can't put the case whether that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but certainly we need to look at what happens from here onwards and whether we need, given that there'll be increase in demand, do we need to make sure that we actually disincentivise people from parking illegally? Further, Mr. Acting Speaker, with those introductory comments, I'd like perhaps now address the issues of the bill itself and the regulations. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this bill amends the Motor Vehicles Act of 1959. Importantly, this scheme hasn't changed since 1998, and clearly things have changed in terms of our thinking about people living with a disability in that time. The bill amends Part 3D of the Motor Vehicles Act. It amends amendments including, it's actually got terms and language which is more appropriate for today's usage. It removes the requirement that an applicant's ability to use public transport must be significantly impeded. As the member for Chaffey quite rightly mentioned, in a lot of parts of our state, there's no alternative to public. There is no public transport, or the public transport is overused, etc. A whole range of different reasons. Even the department itself acknowledges that if you are more than 500 metres from a bus stop or a train station, you know, that is often denies people appropriate access to public transport. It's also, importantly, and something which I will fully support, is allows the eligibility criteria for the parking permits for this area to be prescribed in regulations. It enables us to monitor things, it enables us to then review things and work out if changes need to be made and can be made more quickly, and it's much more responsive. And I think that we need to respond as community attitudes to a whole range of things change as well. By changing the language, I think it's important. It talks about our values as a society. And as I said, even though the word inclusion, unfortunately, is certainly now used as a pejorative, I still think the word inclusion for me means giving people a fair go, and that language which reflects that should be supported. At the moment, people who are eligible for a parking permit have to demonstrate a physical disability which actually, whose speed of movement is severely restricted by the impairment, and I'll read here, from whose ability to use public transport is significantly impeded by the impairment. That will change. Those two things have been a significant barrier to a whole range of people with disability from living meaningful lives or lives without additional barriers to their lives and their families, importantly. Again, while the regulations will retain the existing physical mobility impairment criteria, the regulations will retain the existing physical mobility impairment criteria. Applicants who have a temporary or permanent physical impairment will still need to show that this speed of movement is severely restricted. So while the criteria in terms of is only changed in one element, it does change who is actually eligible, and that's the big change, who is eligible for this new permit. There are a number of things which are not changing, but by removing any legislative barriers to the regulation, specifically including applicants for a disability parking permit have a significant intellectual, cognitive, behavioural or neurological impairment that prevents the person from being able to independently mobilise safely without continuous support of another person. That's the technical language for saying if a parent or family member or a carer, has to actually assist that person to get from point A to point B, then you've met the criteria. And often that is very clear for their safety as well, not only in terms of their being able to physically do it, but often for their safety. And as often I had parents tell me, often their child would literally run away as soon as they're out of the car, run off. And because they're parked so far away from a whole range of things, increase in risk to their personal safety. So that's going to be addressed. I also understand there's no changes being made to the wide arrangements, which I think in this case is okay. The penalties will stay as the same as they are at the moment, as I understand, but hopefully they might be reviewed if people don't use them responsibly. The vision impairment, I understand, is not, the visual impairment requirement is not changing. That's, again, they're people who have actually been eligible already. And that, let me see what else I need to talk about in terms of, yes, the actual, like I said, we need to now to monitor as the increase in use of car parking, so we need to look at that. In terms of the, as been previously mentioned, the number of car parks available is actually if you like, the framework for that is actually in a national code, and that's something which the Minister for Development and Planning will need to monitor to see whether that needs to change. Hopefully, we won't have to do that. Hopefully, we can actually use the existing parking areas responsibly to make sure that works. But if that does change, we will need to then actually look at whether we need to do that. In terms of when this based on, or just one final point, Mr. Speaker, based on what's happened in the other jurisdictions where they've actually changed the rules to reflect what we're proposing here, like Victorian ACT, actually the increase in the parking demand hasn't increased, so we're hopeful that the existing stock of car parks available for people with disability will suffice. The changes will commence on proclamation, and this will certainly occur certainly after the regulations have been made, and I assume that some thought has been given to the regulations already, so that won't be a long time in coming. One would hope that they're made very quickly, and also that the department, I understand, once the change is implemented, the department plans to capture data and reporting on the types of disabilities or conditions for which DPP have been issued. So again, by having in regulations, if this scheme needs to be fine-tuned, there'll be a quicker capacity for the Governor to make regulations in the Executive Council and to fine-tune those. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that this reform is a worthwhile one and certainly will bring relief and fairness to a number of families in our state.